Think Forward. Think Research Channel.
Today on By the Book, Mary Hartman interviews Anne Gordon, Associate Research Professor of History, about her book, The Selected Papers of Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony.
Hello and welcome to By the Book. I'm Mary Hartman. Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony never lived to see the passage of the 19th Amendment in 1920, giving women the right to vote. But each of them devoted over half a century to the cause of women's suffrage. The selected papers of Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony document the extraordinary accomplishments and friendship of these two social and political reformers. My guest today is Anne Gordon, Associate Research Professor at Rutgers and editor of the 6-volume collection. Welcome, Anne.
Thank you, Mary. Nice to be here.
I want to know first, Anne, how did you get involved in this project? And how long have you been involved in it? What intrigued you about it from the beginning? And how did you go about your work? Can you tell us about that?
Well, this is a question that can be answered from several angles. I had actually become interested in the craft of historical editing separately from my interest in Stanton and Anthony. It's one of the oldest crafts in the history profession, and it intrigued me. I liked the research of it, I liked the detective work of it, and I was following various jobs in that kind of work. And at the same time, people were becoming increasingly interested in applying that craft to women's history. The federal government puts money into the editing of the papers of significant American figures, and they were interested in finding women's projects to support, to make these sources available. And my career and that interest on the part of the government converged, and I joined this project, I hate to say it, in 1982.
Well, good for you. You've got stamina, just like your two subjects, for sure. Tell me, how did you get all the papers together in the first place? I understand now that you're in the process of editing them and that there's over 14,000 documents. When you first started, how many of the documents were in one place?
I think probably the largest collections are only within one library, are only in the hundreds. That Stanton and Anthony never had a sense of keeping files and a sort of a proper bureaucratic sense that they should have had about carbon copies or documenting all their activities. And so their letters tended to be in the papers of friends of theirs, a good friend who kept letters, and we were able to retrieve them that way. Or if we wanted their speeches would be in a newspaper that reported it as daily news in the 19th century, but we would have to figure out where they spoke and then find the newspaper that reported it well.
So you were years in the process of collecting these papers,
collecting
right?
was a major, I would say that collecting was full-time for at least 6 years. And then we needed some extra time on top of that to make sense of the 14,000, get them in order.
My goodness.
Elizabeth Cady Stanton never put the year on a single document she ever wrote in her entire life, so one must research and try in context to get dates on things. But the searching and amassing into a single collection is a big part of why these are large federally funded projects, because it's more than any historian could do on his or her own.
Absolutely, and it's also a monument, not only a monumental task, but a monumental gift, I think, that you're giving, not just to American women's history, but to American history, the history of women in leadership in this really monumental task. Can you tell us a little bit about the two women themselves and their personalities as they've emerged as you go through these documents? How are they different and how are they similar?
Well, for viewers who don't know even the basic biographical things, we might distinguish them first by the fact that Stanton was the married mother of 7, whereas Anthony was a single woman all her life. So that you can imagine right away there'd be a lot of differences in what they've got the freedom to do, what they've got the time to do, and the way time would be available to them. Stanton then goes on and enjoys being a grandmother on top of that, which begins to affect the way in which she uses her time and where she is.
How did they first meet?
They met because they shared friends and interests in the reform communities of northern New York State. The exact moment seems to be a time when the famous anti-slavery agitator William Lloyd Garrison had gone to Stanton's hometown in Seneca Falls, New York, and Anthony, who lived in relatively nearby Rochester, New York, came down to hear Garrison, and a mutual friend introduced them on a street corner. In this past summer, the town of Seneca Falls dedicated a statue of the two of them meeting on the appropriate street corner. So it's
wonderful.
Become a
I think
symbol.
a lot of people think that they must have been involved together in the Seneca Falls Convention. This is not true.
That's correct. This is not true. That Stanton was, the Seneca Falls Convention occurred in 1848, and Anthony was still a school teacher at that point. Members of her family were involved in these 1848 start of the movement. But Susan's mind was really on other things. She was trying to become a good school teacher. And it's later, after she decided she was not going to continue to be a school teacher, that she moved into the reform movement, and then eventually this route that led her to meet Stanton.
Well, now, after they met on that street corner, how did their partnership evolve?
In the early years, their partnership is shaped by this difference between one being single and one being the mother of young children. That Anthony was free to move around the state of New York. Reform requires a lot of mobility, especially in a pre-television or pre-radio age. If you want to get your ideas out, you've got to go to that town, you've got to speak to the people, you've got to carry the petitions and sell those newspaper subscriptions. So Anthony would be free to do that, traveling all over the state of New York. And Stanton had lots to say, that she was, certainly that early period, she had done more thinking on the questions of women's rights than Anthony had, and she was an excellent writer. I think Anthony was a good writer, but she never was sure of herself as a writer. And so Stanton would help formulate the ideas and the language in which to present issues of reform, and then Anthony would hit the road and meet the people and do the organizing and mobilization. As they got older, the division is not quite as tidy. I think the division then, when Stanton is able to be mobile, probably would break down to Anthony had more patience with meetings, parliamentary procedure, the details of organization, whereas Stanton liked to just throw her ideas around and express herself, and much more impatient.
Do you get a sense of whether they disagreed much in the process of developing their joint plans together, or whether they were pretty much on target with one another? How did that work out, and did you find any evidence of strong disagreement in any particular area?
They disagree. There are several famous phases of disagreement in their lives. I think it's important, though, to realize that over a 51-year friendship, they had worked out how to disagree and still go on working together, and this is one of the strengths in their friendship. They disagreed, I think, more after the Civil War, when there were more political questions, when they had real chances to influence Congress or to influence a state legislature or to make a decision about how to respond during a presidential election year. And they tended to have differences often there, where one of them was willing to, say, compromise with the Republican Party because it had said something nice about women, and the other one would say, no, let's still stand back and try to force alliances, try to force change. And that's, it was those kinds of things they disagreed on. I think they could get angry at each other over almost anything, as good friends can, whether it's the stresses of traveling together, or whether it's sorting out who's going to pay for what, or the funding of something within the movement. But the big disagreements were usually at the strategic level.
Did they spend a whole lot of time together in working things out, or did they correspond a lot? How do you sense that they actually operated on a day-to-day basis?
Again, this changes over the course of their lives. In the early days with Stanton homebound, what we can see in the bits of documents that are left is that Anthony would travel down to Seneca Falls, maybe help take care of the babies to free Stanton up to do some writing. They'd get things discussed. Then Anthony would leave again. And I think for Stanton that meant, you know, the classic, an adult has just come into this house of babies to give me somebody to talk to. And for Anthony, it meant she got refueled for going out to talk to the people. Mm-hmm. Later, there's all kinds of funny patterns about how they saw each other. Anthony spent quite a lot of time in Stanton's house in Tenafly, New Jersey in the 1870s, 1880s, when that was appropriate. There's also wonderful stories about them bumping into each other on trains in the Midwest. Both of them, after the Civil War, became lecturers of national renown and would be traveling for months on end. And sometimes they ran into each other on purpose. Let's meet up in Chicago, let's meet up in Ann Arbor. And other times was completely accidental. Anthony's diary says, got on the train and met Mrs. Stanton, sound asleep in a corner, her gray curls nodding.
Oh, wonderful.
And we rode together to the next stop.
Now, I suppose since you're working on the papers of both of them that you don't like this question, but I'm going to ask it anyway. Do you have a favorite as between these two women?
I don't think I have a favorite. I think I like them both a lot, but for very different reasons. And some days I don't want to be with one of them, or I do want to be with the other one. They are so busy and so full of ideas about what needs to be done and how to go about doing it, that even after all these years that I've been sitting around reading their papers, I still learn things.
Can you explain where their stamina came from? When you read that this was a friendship of 51 years, and of course neither woman lived even to vote, how did they manage to go on from day to day? Did they sustain one another? Was it others involved in the movement who helped them keep going? Just how did they do it, do you think?
This is a question that occurs to me more and more as I'm editing papers for the same age I am, and I wonder if I would have their stamina. I think that it's very hard for us nowadays to imagine the commitment to the reform itself that kept them going. And I really think that's a major factor, that they really think it's possible to make this enormous change in American political life of introducing women into the voting booth, and that drive gets them going. I think they also learn that they like an audience. They're good speakers. They have a large following. 2,000 people will come out in a city to hear them when they show up to speak in the late 19th century. And I think they like that give and take. They like that opportunity to hear it. But how they keep up through traveling through the winter. Lecturers went out in the winter.
It took incredible energy, I know. We have to take a break right now, but we'll be back with Anne Gordon.
Actually, I'm reading a book. Yeah, it's a Bruce Lee book. It's a book about Bruce Lee. It's autobiography. I'm reading that right now.
The Miseducation of the Negro by Carver G. Woodson.
Actually, it just talks about his life, his philosophies, like towards life and everything. It's a pretty cool book.
It was very interesting to see how the education of the Negro was broken down in terms of religion and social activities and in colleges and universities, and where there were steps that were taken that were wrong for the benefit of the Negroes coming right out of slavery during Reconstruction.
If you like Bruce Lee and like stuff like that, I think it's a good book for you.
I would say it's a reiteration of what's wrong with the black community in America today and in America right after slavery during Reconstruction.
Hello and welcome back to By the Book. We've been discussing the history of the women's suffrage movement with Anne Gordon, editor of the selected papers of Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony. Anne, tell me, I was very intrigued to read this wonderful, wonderful book, the first volume in the collection. It's entitled In the School of Anti-Slavery, and it deals with the years from 1840 to 1866. Can you tell us first what you see as the highlights of that period in their lives? What happened that really stood out for you as you were looking at those documents? And by the way, how in the world did you manage to select the particular ones you selected, or was that fairly straightforward?
Nothing about selecting 10% of the documents is straightforward. It's a heart-wrenching choice every time. This volume traces the years of their learning how to be reformers. And it has a dynamic in it that's of young people learning to do something new. And I really like it for that. It's also a volume in which the questions of your private life and your public life as a reformer come into play a lot because of Stanton being a mother of young children, because Anthony's still very much a daughter in her parents' household, and you get a feel of them breaking away in an era when women didn't have many chances to break away. Mainly,
Can you say just a little bit about that? How about Elizabeth Cady Stanton's husband? How did he react to her increasing involvement in all this activity?
the evidence is very slim, something that I think the Stanton family probably systematically made sure we did not have. He himself had been a leading anti-slavery agitator and agent before he married Elizabeth Cady. And I think probably he's their ally. That is, I think both Stanton and Anthony are probably learning a lot of the skills of being a lecturer and a reformer and a petition circulator from him. And occasionally we can catch glimpses of that. But I think he's also caught a bit because here he is, a man whose marriage is made very conspicuous by the fact that his wife is one of the leading reformers in an era when men didn't have to deal in general with the public lives of their wives. And I think that's a strain on him. But I don't see places where he's specifically fighting it or overtly fighting it. There may have been little subplots going on inside that household.
Do either of the women talk in any of the documents that you have about their own sense of themselves as public figures? Stanton
does primarily because of these conflicts. That is, even if Henry Stanton is not standing in her way, he's also not coming home to help out so that she can get free and go do her reform. She is under much more conflict with her father, and she talks about herself and the struggle to have the courage to go on when under their father's disapproving gaze and some of her brothers-in-law's disapproving gaze, and that combined with being at home with young children, sometimes you get the sense is almost more than she can bear, and she needs some encouragement. Anthony is not very self-examining ever in her life, and I don't hear her articulating this. She will assess particular skills, like whether she can write, whether she can speak, but she doesn't seem to ever question what she's gone to do, that is, to make a career out of being a change agent, as we would nowadays say.
What are the highlights of that period after they meet in 1851, up until the end of that first volume in 1866? What are the key things that happen in their career as reformers together then?
What they really do is develop a model for how to fight for changes that we now call women's rights in one state, their state, New York. It becomes the model for agitators elsewhere. And they analyze in what ways the laws of the state of New York discriminate against women, whether it's laws to do with the custody of children, the divorce laws, voting laws, jury laws, wage laws, who can sign contracts, on and on through economic and familial categories of law. And they first lay out that whole body of law and point out to the legislators, educate the legislators and the people of New York that you've got differences in your law all the way down the list in the ways men and women are treated. And then they begin to systematically pressure for changes in those laws to give women equal economic power, equal power over their children, equal they hope equal political power. And they actually make some ground before the Civil War.
Do they find allies in that legislature, or is this pressure from the outside that finally makes them achieve some victories in these areas?
I think it's a little bit of both. They think that in the late 1850s, when the Republican Party is founded and becomes a power in the state of New York as it's becoming a power in the nation, they think that that group of reformers, that New York's Republicans, are coming out of communities that understand the language of women's rights. And I've not closely enough analyzed the precise votes inside the New York State Legislature to be sure, but they credit the new Republican Party with coming along with them and giving them the votes they need to change, in particular, the laws having to do with married women's property, which is a big area that they have victories in before the Civil War. And then the second big obvious thing of a book that covers 1840 to 1866 is This Nation's in a Civil War.
Of course.
And these women have been anti-slavery activists before the war, and they find ways to carry on that activity through the war. They are really the leaders in a major national petition campaign to Congress that leads to the passage of the 13th Amendment that abolishes slavery. And this gives them new political skills, too, because now they're dealing not just with the New York State Legislature and with the women of New York State. Now they have a national following, and they're dealing with members of Congress. And
talk a little bit about that. We know that in the later years of their lives, and of course at their deaths, they were lionized in many ways. When did they start being recognized as the real leaders in this movement? Was it early on? Were they recognized, and was there a following that was very positive, or did that only come later on in their lives?
I think it happens very fast. Within the reform community, people recognize Stanton almost immediately. Here she is at this little tiny women's rights convention in Seneca Falls in 1848, and within a year and a half, another little group in Ohio that wants to hold a women's rights meeting knows to turn to Stanton to get the definitive words for their meeting. She has to send a letter. She's got too many children to travel to Ohio. But right away, within the reform community, they recognize her as a gifted, articulate woman in their midst. And Anthony is recognized as a very good organizer within a very few years of being there. Again, we're talking about inside the community of reformers, but that community is across the north, that people in Wisconsin, from Wisconsin east, south from Washington, D.C. to Maine, would have known their names inside the reform community. Their national reputations, I think, probably really start to build during the Civil War, that their work on this anti-slavery petition and the appreciation there was by senators and members of the House for their efforts, and just newspaper kind of attention they would get then really began to build their national reputation. And then it's escalating constantly thereafter. By 1880, they have an enormous following. They have been lecturing for a decade across the country. They can put out a call, an appeal in a casual way, and women, all kinds of women will respond in all parts of the country. Some of them will have never been to a women's rights meeting, but they recognize in some vague way that if Stan and Anthony ask you to do something and you agree with them, do it. And it's a loose leadership.
Towards the end of their lives, the recognition for Anthony, and I think in historical memory now, Anthony's name seems to be bigger, or am I misinterpreting? We have the Susan B. Anthony Dollar and all the rest. What was Elizabeth Cady Stanton's reputation eclipsed in those later years? What would you have to say about that?
I think you'd have to say it's eclipsed, and I think not everybody is in agreement of those who have tried to understand this as to exactly what happened. There seem to be a number of factors. Partly, Anthony made a convenient symbolic figure after her death for the suffrage movement. Here's this single woman who devoted her life to the cause. She has certain qualities of the saint, the martyr for the cause, died before she got to vote. And so there was an abstract thing that had less to do with Anthony than the need for a symbol as you continued the struggle to get the vote that kind of brought her up. She had also stayed on the road and in contact with organized suffragists for longer than Stanton, so that she was still on the road meeting people from coast to coast right up until her death in 1906. So this younger generation of women suffragists that's going to carry the battle on to 1920 has met her.
Right.
Whereas Stanton is a name, they may have read things of Stanton's, but she isn't traveling much. They never get to know her, and that's a distance. And then also Stanton was a more rebellious reformer. And some of Stanton's ideas at the end of her life, particularly her ideas about the role of religion in the oppression of women, made her a little embarrassing to the more conservative women suffragists that
that's
began
very helpful. We have only a minute left, but I do want to find out about your role in Ken Burns' documentary, Not for Ourselves Alone, on the lives of these two women. I know that they consulted closely with you. Can you tell us a little bit about that experience?
Well, it was a lot of fun to do. They did consult with us. What we had published, they could use. That came down, researchers came down and worked in our office.
In the film?
I was in the film. And the researchers came down and worked in our office, and I had a chance to read the script more than once before it went into production, and then was called up to review and argue about the storyline of the film once it was in I guess they call it a second cut or a first cut. But it was a wonderful experience of trying to teach people history who then teach it in a different way from mine.
Unfortunately, we're running out of time, but I do want to say that the second volume will be out when, Anne?
They say June.
And what years will it cover?
It covers 1866 to 1873.
Wonderful. We look forward to it. My guest has been Anne Gordon, editor of the selected papers of Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony. I'm Mary Hartman. Thank you for joining us on By the Book.